Every Greenville native has heard of the supposed monster of Greenville countless times. As a story told by parents to scare their kids, told by friends around campfires or local tabloid newspapers, over the year the details of the original story were jumbled, changed, or forgotten. New ones emerged, but a few things stayed consistent throughout all the countless iterations of the story. You had to invite the monster into your house, but refusing the monster entry would be extraordinarily difficult. Through convincing, coercion, threats, or begging, the monster in the stories always gained the victim's permission to enter. The next part was the supposed account of horrific screaming, the police busting in through the door only to find the mangled corpses of the family residing in the house and bloody footprints leading into the wilderness. It used to be that any reasonable person would dismiss the stories without a doubt in their mind. I always thought our parents told us about the monster so we wouldn't let strangers inside the house. It made sense at the time. That's how folktales emerge, right? But something that happened in my childhood made dismissing the story as a mere fantasy difficult, to say the least. Mrs. Sophia Green was my neighbor for as long as I can remember. The sweetest old woman. She would bake us cookies, invite the kids of the block over to play cards. I used to stay and talk to her whenever I got the chance. Granny Green is what the kids of the block used to call her. She was a widowed woman. Back then, my parents used to say she needed the company, and we would occasionally celebrate holidays over at her house. Her house was next to mine, and her bedroom opposite to mine. This meant if I stayed up, I would see her walk to the window, shoot me a warm smile, and wave at me before closing the curtains. On some nights, however, she would go straight to bed, her bright green eyes open and seemingly luminescent in the dark. On those nights, I would fall asleep under the comforting gaze of Granny Green. On one such night, after falling asleep to the sound of the rustling autumn leaves and under Granny Green's warm eyes, I was awoken in a jolt. It took me several seconds to hear the loud beeping, a fire alarm. I ran to the window to find, to my great horror, that Granny Green's house was the source of the beeping and the light of the flames bouncing off the walls emerging from her windows. It was at this moment, in my hypnotic, frozen state of absolute horror, I heard a soft knock on my door and then another one. I ran downstairs to find my beloved Granny Green standing at our door, coughing and spluttering, but seemingly fine and with her cat in her arms. I opened the door as my parents walked out of their bedroom, still in a dazed, half-wakened state. I opened the door to Granny Green. She looked frail, the few smears of soot on her accentuating her paleness in the November night. "Please, son, let me inside to call the fire brigade." I stood there stunned. I could barely understand what was happening. I mumbled to her in response. "What was that, son? I can barely hear in all this commotion." It was now my dad had caught on and pulled me away from our doorway. "Are you hurt, Mrs. Green? Please come inside." Just like that, her entire demeanor changed. Her pleasant green eyes became focused, bright, and cruel. She lunged at my father with shocking speed despite her age, her hands grasping at his throat and her thumbs pushing hard enough at his throat to crush his windpipe. My father was trying to get her off him, his face turning red and hands clawing away at her face. It was now she changed her target. She put both of her thumbs into his eyes, pushing hard enough for the blood to gush out of his eye sockets. My mother and I screamed in horror. I felt as though I was stuck in place. I knew I had to run, but my legs would not allow it, so I stood there as her thumbs sank into my father's mutilated eye sockets. In a few seconds, his fighting turned from a panicked struggle to a frenetic twitch. It felt like minutes standing in that hallway, but she had murdered my father in a few seconds. I snapped out of my trance and I ran, fast as my legs could carry me upstairs, to the sound of horrific screaming and loud thuds as the monster of Greenville set upon my mom. I hid under my bed. I have no feeling for how long the thumping went on, but to me, it seemed never-ending. Through my petrified tears, I saw them again, the bright, luminescent eyes of Granny Green, beloved Granny Green. She, or it, was she even human? It slowly walked to my bed, knowing exactly where I'd hid myself. I tried to shut my eyes like it was all a dream, and I would wake up to my mom making breakfast and my dad reading the paper. But alas, there I was, hoping in vain it couldn't hear my sobbing. Something touched my head. I opened my eyes, finding to my horror the now contorted and frenzied featured of Granny Green. her face mere inches from mine. Slowly and calmly, it extended her arm towards me and pulled me out from under the bed by my hair. I remember whispering to myself between my cries for help. I whispered, or rather prayed, not like this, please. Granny Green held me still, suspended in the air by a tuft of my hair in her hand, inspecting its long and out-bloodied fingernails, drawing the inevitable out for an additional few seconds, until the sound of sirens began blaring in the night. The blue lights flowed in from the road. I hit my head on the cupboard, hard. I stayed in my room, bleeding profusely from my head until the police stormed in. Since that night, I've lived in an orphanage. I take medicine and go to counselors, but it doesn't help. I was diagnosed with PTSD and schizophrenia. My family had been brutally murdered on the night of the fire. That much was clear to anyone, but what wasn't clear was who did it. Mrs. Sophia Green burned to a crisp in the fire that consumed her entire house.